She was convinced she would die within the week. Knees tucked beneath her, back against a damp stone wall, a young Japanese signal operator stared at the dirt floor of her new prison, an Allied holding facility in Burma. Her stomach folded in on itself. For 3 days, all she'd eaten was boiled water, thick with the smell of rust. She didn't expect kindness. She didn't even expect food. But then the scent hit her. Warm, savory, impossible. Potatoes, lamb, onion. A smell that didn't belong here, that felt like a memory, or a hallucination. She blinked slowly, afraid to trust her senses. But then the door creaked open. A British soldier, older, with a stained apron and burn marks on his forearms, appeared holding a tray. On it, a slice of shepherd's pie. Steaming, whole, real. "Eat up," he muttered, as if speaking to his daughter. She reached for the plate with shaking hands, terrified this was a trick. It wasn't. But long before the scent of shepherd's pie found her, long before warmth and food softened the edges of fear, there was only chaos. Keiko, then barely 20, had been stationed as a signal operator near the Burmese front. The walls of the field station trembled with the dull roar of artillery. Radios crackled with static and half-spoken orders. Her superior, a captain with sunken eyes and a trembling jaw, barked for the women to destroy documents, burn maps, and pack their gear for immediate evacuation. Outside, the trees burned. Somewhere beyond the hills, the British were advancing. The sun hung low and red over the jungle, casting long shadows as Keiko ran from one corridor to the next, smoke curling through her hair. They were told the trucks would arrive. They didn't. They were told reinforcements would hold the line. They didn't. And so, as the outpost collapsed, the remaining women, nurses, clerks, operators, were pulled from their bunks and marched out under the watch of their own officers. Not to safety, but deeper into the forest, where surrender waited like a noose. The chaos of those final hours was carved into Keiko's memory, not by the screams or the gunfire, but by the looks on the faces of the men who had led them. Not rage, not pride, just defeat. When the group was finally intercepted by British patrols near a clearing days later, the Japanese soldiers dropped their weapons in silence. The women, hands raised, huddled together, eyes fixed on the mud. What followed was not a battle. It was a herding. The British, rifle muzzles level and fingers poised, motioned for the women to form ranks. The jungle pulsed with humidity and insect drone, and the women obeyed, numb. They were marched without explanation, without pause. For Keiko, the hours blurred, feet blistered, stomach clenched in on itself, the air thick with the stench of sweat and rotting foliage. Still, it wasn't the hardship that frightened her most. It was what she believed was coming next. They had all been told, again and again, in barracks, in training halls, in whispered lectures under cover of night, that to be taken by the Allies was a fate worse than death. The British, they were told, were not men, but beasts. They raped, they tortured, they mocked women before starving them slowly, reducing them to begging shells. Bushido taught that capture was dishonor, but their officers went further. It was doom. Keiko had memorized those warnings like scripture. She could hear her sergeant's voice even now, rasping through the jungle as they fled. Better to bite your tongue and drown in blood than let them take you. Some of the women wept quietly during the march. Others hardened their faces, praying it would be quick. But no one expected mercy. Not after what they'd been told. The march stretched across 3 days. They were given water, but no food. One girl collapsed and was dragged by 2 others until she could walk again. The silence among them was unbearable. No one dared speak above a whisper, and when they did, it was only to ask, "Do you think they'll kill us quickly? Or would they bury us, or leave us in the trees?" Hunger gnawed at their thoughts like a parasite. Their hands trembled. Their uniforms, soaked in sweat, clung to their frames like burial shrouds. Keiko thought often of her younger brother, left behind in Nagasaki, and wondered if he would ever know what had happened to her. She imagined him picking through rubble, searching for her name in a casualty list. She imagined her mother's face at the shrine, lighting incense for a daughter already considered dead. When they finally reached the holding camp, little more than a cluster of tents wrapped in barbed wire, the women expected to be beaten, stripped, or shamed. But what met them instead was a silence just as strange as their march. British soldiers, unsmiling but not brutal, recorded names. They didn't leer, they didn't yell. They handed out coarse blankets and gestured toward the tents. There was no food yet, just ground to sit on. Just waiting. And yet that silence, that absence of cruelty, was its own kind of terror. Because if this wasn't the nightmare they were promised, then what was it? If death wasn't waiting, what was? Keiko sat on the dirt floor of the tent, knees drawn to her chest, and tried not to hope. She didn't want to feel hope. Hope made you weak. Hope got you killed. But then, somewhere in the distance, carried faintly by the wind, came a smell. Potatoes. Lamb. Onion. Her eyes shot open. It couldn't be. Keiko blinked. Her lips parted slightly, drawing in the scent again, just to be sure. It was still there. Thicker now. More present. Meat and onions. Potatoes and something earthy. It drifted in slow waves across the compound, wrapping around her senses like a memory that didn't belong. She sat up straighter, her arms braced behind her on the rough canvas floor of the tent, and looked toward the edge of the camp, where the scent seemed strongest. Others stirred too. Women beside her shifted on their heels, eyes narrowing, noses lifting. A girl 2 places down whispered, "It smells like stew." Another woman, older, shook her head with suspicion. "It's not for us," she muttered. "It's bait." They had arrived only an hour ago, marched into the gates with no ceremony, no violence. No one had struck them. No one screamed. British soldiers stood posted at the entrances and along the perimeter, rifles slung across shoulders, movements clipped and efficient. The camp itself was not much, just rows of low canvas tents bordered by a few wooden barracks, barbed wire fencing in the horizon. It wasn't clean. Mud caked everything. Flies circled in clusters. And yet, compared to the jungle march, it might as well have been a palace. Their bodies betrayed how much they had endured. Keiko could feel the crust of sweat along her collarbone, the lice crawling beneath her blouse, the throb behind her eyes from dehydration. Her hands were raw from days of stumbling through underbrush and falling to her knees. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. None of them had. When they entered the camp, several women collapsed outright. A British medic crouched beside one of them and pressed water to her lips without a word. Keiko had watched, breath caught in her throat. The soldiers didn't smile, but they didn't leer either. They didn't shout or shove or call them names. They treated the women like cargo, like something to be logged, processed, and stored. It should have been humiliating, and perhaps it was, but the absence of overt cruelty left a strange hollow in its place. Indifference, it seemed, was easier to endure than hatred. One soldier, young and thin-faced, met Keiko's eyes for a moment as she passed. She braced herself for contempt. Instead, he blinked, looked away, and resumed writing in a ledger. That was all. Inside the tent they had been handed blankets, not thick ones, not clean, but they were warm, and they were real. Keiko wrapped hers around her shoulders, more from habit than comfort, and sat still as the others settled around her. A guard passed by the flap, calling out something in English. The women didn't understand, but his tone wasn't angry. It sounded like an announcement. Then came the routine. They were counted, lined up, their names butchered, repeated, and scribbled into notebooks. They were assigned tent numbers, given slates and ration tokens. The process moved fast, impersonal, like clockwork. No explanation, no soft words, just roll call after roll call, shouted commands they barely understood, and the steady rhythm of boots on gravel. It was during the second roll call that Keiko first saw the crates. Dozens of them, stacked near the far edge of the camp, behind a mess tent. She caught the glimpse through a tear in the canvas. Wooden boxes, stenciled in black letters she couldn't read. 2 men unloaded them with practiced motion. From inside came the clink of metal pans. And then, that smell again, the scent of shepherd's pie. It swirled through the air with devastating familiarity. Keiko felt her stomach knot in response. She hadn't eaten meat in weeks. Most of the others hadn't either. They had been surviving on scraps, rice husks, bark powder, the occasional boiled root if it hadn't already gone sour. The idea that a stew was cooking nearby, with real potatoes and actual lamb, seemed obscene. "They're trying to break us," whispered the girl next to her. "It's psychological." But Keiko wasn't so sure. There was no guard watching them with a smirk, no jeering eyes watching their hunger. The soldiers kept to themselves. They spoke mostly to one another. Their hands were full, paperwork, crates, tents, lists. They weren't trying to make a spectacle of the food. They weren't trying to torment, which made it all the more confusing. Keiko pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to will it into silence. She couldn't stop thinking of the scent. She hated how it made her feel. Not just hungry, but hopeful. And hope, she knew, was the most dangerous feeling of all. She lay down that night, curled in her blanket, staring at the dim outline of the tent roof, trying not to breathe too deeply. But it was still there, faint, lingering, stubborn. The smell of potatoes and meat and something warm she couldn't name. She closed her eyes and told herself again, "It's not for you." But in the morning, the trays arrived. Keiko didn't move at first. She thought it must be a mistake, perhaps for the guards, perhaps only for the sick. But then she saw the soldier walking down the row, stopping in front of each tent, placing trays just inside the flaps. He didn't look at them. He didn't say a word. Just placed the food, turned, and walked on. When he reached her tent, Keiko watched the tray appear, as if conjured by the hand of a ghost. The smell struck her first, hotter, sharper than before. Potatoes, meat, onion, gravy. Her stomach turned with hunger so fierce it felt like pain. Still, she didn't touch it. Not yet. Around her, the others stared, too. No one said anything. One girl near the entrance took a step forward, then stopped. Another whispered, "It's a trick. It has to be." Their officers had told them this would happen. That the enemy would lure them with food only to humiliate them. Keiko's mouth was dry, her hands trembling, but the tray sat motionless in the dirt, steaming softly, real and waiting. And then someone moved. A nurse, the oldest among them, perhaps 30, crouched, picked up her tray, and sniffed it. The rest watched as she knelt by her bedroll and, slowly, without expression, began to eat. No scream followed, no collapse. She just kept chewing, eyes fixed ahead, as though daring someone to stop her. It broke the spell. One by one, the others reached for their trays. Some picked at the food with their fingers. Others used the dull tin spoons tucked at the corner. Some wept while eating, silent tears falling onto their laps. One girl gagged after the first bite, not from disgust, but from the shock of flavor after so long without it. A few still refused, arms crossed, eyes locked on the opposite wall. Keiko held the tray in her lap. The food was simple, mashed potatoes over stewed lamb, bits of carrot and onion hidden beneath the crust. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't delicate. But the smell stirred something ancient inside her. She took a bite, and the world shifted. The taste was hot and savory, salt blooming across her tongue. She closed her eyes as she chewed, and for a moment she was no longer in a British prison camp. She was in her grandmother's kitchen in Kumamoto, watching a pot of nikujaga simmer on the stove. Potatoes, onions, soy, and beef. Not the same ingredients, but the warmth. The warmth was identical. It was unbearable. Keiko swallowed hard and stared down at the tray, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. This wasn't just food. This was confusion on a plate. She had prepared herself for pain, for degradation, for everything she had been warned about. But no one had warned her about this. The British cook didn't come into the tent, but later she saw him outside, stirring a massive pot over a coal fire, apron stained, eyes tired. He didn't look at the women with pity or with pride. He just worked, quietly, repetitively, like this was his duty and nothing more. And somehow that made it worse, because if it had been a show, if he had laughed or gloated or explained himself, she could have dismissed it. But his silence left room for something else. Possibility. That night she didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of confusion. The shepherd's pie had settled in her stomach like an anchor. She kept turning the taste over in her mind. The warmth, the meat, the quiet behind it. It didn't fit inside the story she had been told. It didn't fit inside the war. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Keiko saw him again the next morning. The coal fire was already burning, black smoke twisting into the pale sky as Sergeant Arthur Morgan bent over the pot, stirring slowly with a long-handled spoon. His apron was stained, his sleeves rolled, revealing forearms marked with old burns and faded ink. His face was unreadable, weathered but not hardened, eyes sunken with age but not cruelty. He didn't speak much, at least not around them. He moved like a man used to being ignored, and perhaps preferred it that way. But Keiko watched. She watched the way he moved between the crates and kettles, how he adjusted the seasoning with a small pinch of salt, how he nodded to himself after tasting the broth. He never lingered. He never looked pleased. If he noticed the women observing him, he didn't show it. And yet, there was something about the way he worked, with care, not just speed, that left her unsettled. Sergeant Morgan had once fought in a different war. The older guard said so, casually between cigarettes. Flanders, they whispered. Trench foot, gas masks, and 2 sons, both lost in Europe, one in Belgium, one in the sky over France. But Morgan never spoke of them. He just stirred the pot. Day after day, meal after meal, as if filling the bellies of the enemy was a duty handed down from somewhere higher than command. He was not a hero, and he didn't act like one. But he was a constant. Rain or heat, hunger or silence, Morgan was there by the fire. His presence became part of the rhythm of the camp. Keiko began to look for him each morning, not because she expected anything, but because he was the only part of this strange new world that didn't shift. To the other soldiers, he was a curiosity. Some of the younger guards muttered behind his back, rolling their eyes when he handed out trays himself instead of letting them do it. One even asked, loudly enough for the prisoners to hear, "Why feed them like people when they wouldn't do the same for us?" Morgan didn't answer. He just wiped his hands on his apron and walked away. But Keiko heard, and she remembered it. What puzzled her most wasn't his silence or his cooking. It was his eyes. They were not kind, exactly, but they were not filled with contempt. He looked at her the way a man might look at the rain, acknowledging, accepting, without judgment. It was that absence of hatred that unnerved her. One afternoon, she passed him on her way to the water barrels. Their paths crossed near the storage hut. She bowed, instinctively, shallow and quick. Morgan didn't stop walking, but he tipped his head, just slightly, as if returning the gesture. It was so small a movement that it might have gone unnoticed, but Keiko felt it like a weight in her chest. He was the first man in weeks to treat her as though she still belonged to the world. Later that night, under the dim glow of the camp's oil lamps, Keiko sat in her tent and tried to remember the last time a man had fed her without expecting something in return. Obedience, loyalty, sacrifice. Even before the war, food had always come with a price. But Morgan didn't ask for gratitude, he didn't ask for anything, he just cooked. The other women began to notice too. The meals arrived at the same hour. The portions fair. The flavors, though simple, were steady. There were stews, boiled vegetables, sometimes even biscuits. And always Morgan was behind it, never smiling, never speaking. But there, a fixture. For many that was more unsettling than violence would have been, because kindness, especially quiet, persistent kindness, dismantles fear in ways brutality never could. And in those long, uncertain days behind the wire, it was Morgan's food that began to fill the silence. Not with answers, but with something else. Something dangerously close to trust. Weeks passed. The color returned to Keiko's face so slowly that she hardly noticed it at first. Her skin no longer clung to her bones. The hollows beneath her eyes softened. Even her hair, once brittle with neglect, began to regain its dark luster. She could feel her strength returning, but with it came an ache that had nothing to do with her body. Guilt, steady and suffocating, began to replace hunger. Each night she thought of home, her mother in Nagasaki, her younger brother still training in the army, their faces fading into the haze of memory. Were they still alive? Were they starving while she ate the food of her enemies? The thought hollowed her from the inside out. Each bite of shepherd's pie, each spoonful of stew, turned bitter on her tongue when she imagined her family boiling weeds for supper. The paradox was unbearable. Captivity had given her life, while freedom might have condemned the ones she loved. The camp, meanwhile, settled into its strange rhythm. Work in the mornings, rest in the afternoons, supper at dusk. The guards rarely spoke to them unless necessary. The British discipline, steady, unbending, almost cold, left little room for fear, but no room for warmth either. The only exception was Morgan. He kept cooking, same as always. She never saw him idle. He moved like time itself, indifferent, unhurried, unstoppable. And every time the smell of meat and potatoes drifted through camp, shame pricked at her heart. One morning, during inspection, a British officer approached their tent holding a bundle of paper and pencils. He spoke slowly, his voice formal but not cruel, explaining that the prisoners could write home. The announcement struck Keiko like a blow. A murmur rippled through the women. Disbelief, then confusion. Some clutched at the papers as though they might vanish. Others simply stared. That night, the tents fell into silence. The women sat cross-legged on their bedrolls, staring at the blank pages before them. Keiko did too. The sheet felt impossibly white. The pencil hovered above it like a blade. She had waited weeks for a chance to send word home, to tell her family she was alive. But now, with the opportunity before her, she realized she didn't know what she was allowed to say. If she wrote the truth, that the British were feeding them, treating them humanely, the letter might be confiscated. Or worse, her family might never believe it. And if she wrote lies, that she was suffering, starving, it would only deepen their despair. The blank page demanded honesty, but honesty was dangerous. Keiko pressed the pencil down, then stopped. Around her the sound of scratching filled the air. Some women wrote quickly, desperate, tears wetting the paper. Others still hadn't begun. The guard said the letters would be inspected, translated, and sent through official channels, though no one knew what that meant. Perhaps they would never leave the camp at all. Perhaps they were only a test. Keiko stared until her hand cramped. Then finally she began to write, slowly, carefully. "Mother, I am alive." She paused. The words looked fragile, almost guilty. She added another line. "They feed us. I do not understand this war anymore." That was all. She signed her name, folded the paper, and handed it to the guard when he came by. He nodded once, tucking it into his satchel without a word. That night, Keiko lay awake, listening to the distant clatter of kitchen pots. She imagined Morgan still at his post, stirring his pot of stew, unaware that his food had reached across oceans in the form of her letter. She imagined the paper carried on the wind, somehow finding her mother's trembling hands. But deep down, she knew the truth. The letter would never arrive. And perhaps it was better that way, because how could her mother ever understand that kindness could exist inside a cage? Shepherd's pie returned the next Thursday. Keiko had begun to expect it by then, though she would never admit that out loud. It arrived just after roll call, when the heat of the day began to settle into their bones, and the sharp scent of coal smoke crept through the fabric walls of their tent. No one announced it. There was no ceremony. But the moment that scent curled into the air, lamb, onion, butter, a ripple spread through the women like the stirring of water before a storm. Some smiled without realizing. Others turned away in shame. The pie came once a week, always on the same day, always the same way. A tin tray passed through the flap, still hot, still steaming. It was never lavish, never excessive, but it was warm, filling, real, and over time it became more than food. It became a strange kind of anchor, something to measure the days by, something that made time feel real again. To be fed once is a shock. To be fed every week, exactly, predictably, without punishment or reward, begins to change you. Keiko noticed it first in her posture. She no longer hunched as deeply. She no longer flinched at footsteps. The fear had not vanished, but it had been replaced by something quieter, something even more dangerous: stability. The other women changed too. Hunger still lingered beneath their skin, but it no longer ruled them. They began to speak more, not just in whispers, but in murmured conversation. One afternoon, during supper, a nurse from Yokohama stared at her tray and muttered dryly, "Better than my fiancé's cooking?" A burst of laughter broke out across the tent, sharp, sudden, real. It startled even the guards. Keiko covered her mouth, stifling a smile, and glanced through the gap in the tent's flap. Morgan stood where he always did, by the kitchen shed, arms folded, apron stained, face unreadable. But there was something softer in the way he turned his head, something almost like amusement in the corner of his mouth. He had heard them. It became a ritual, not just the meal but the moment, the anticipation, the smell. The way Morgan's silhouette moved behind the open kitchen tent, sleeves rolled to his elbows, steam curling around his frame like smoke from an old dream. He never spoke to them, but each week, when Keiko received her tray and looked across the yard, she would find his eyes for just a moment. He would nod. She would nod back. And that was all. There was no conversation, no explanation. But in those glances passed across soup pots and muddy ground, a kind of silent pact formed, a recognition. She was not a soldier to him, not a prisoner. She was someone to be fed. Keiko could not explain why this mattered, only that it did, because the food no longer tasted like surrender. It tasted like survival. and for women who had been told again and again that capture was death, that surrender meant shame. To sit down once a week and eat shepherd's pie made by a man who didn't speak to them but never looked away was the beginning of something even more powerful than comfort. It was the start of unlearning. Every Thursday chipped away at a different piece of the story they'd been taught. Because if the enemy was capable of ritual, of care, of shepherd's pie served without venom, then what else might have been a lie? The rumors came slowly, like water dripping through cracks. A guard speaking too loudly in the corner of the camp. A newspaper left unattended near the canteen. An overheard conversation between two officers, cut short when they noticed the women listening. Keiko didn't understand much English, but she understood tone and silence. And the silence that followed certain names, Changi, Bataan, Rangoon, carried more weight than words ever could. The first real fragment came from a nurse who had once worked as a translator. She whispered it in the tent one night, her voice shaking. I heard, they found Allied soldiers in a camp, skeletons, beaten. Some had no toes. Keiko said nothing. Neither did the others. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Weeks later, confirmation arrived in the form of a newspaper clipping, torn, yellowed, passed between the guards like a relic. One of them dropped it or left it on purpose. No one knew, but the women got hold of it. The photograph was grainy but unmistakable. A line of men, skin stretched over bone, eyes sunken, ribs protruding like branches from a dying tree. Keiko stared at it for a long time. Not just the image, but the headline. She could only read a few words. War crimes, prisoners, starvation. She turned the paper over, as if hoping the truth might be less sharp on the other side. But it wasn't. The truth cut like glass. Up until that moment, Keiko had carried her shame in private, the kind of quiet guilt that lives in the pit of your stomach, in the space between spoonfuls of food. But this was different. This was not about eating shepherd's pie while her mother went hungry. This was about realizing that the mercy she had received had not been returned. That while she sat in silence beside other women, bowls warm in their hands, someone else, an American, a Brit, maybe a boy younger than her brother, was starving in a camp built by her own country. She had not given the orders. She had not swung the baton or rationed the rice, but she had worn the uniform. She had saluted the same flag. She had recited the oaths with just as much certainty. Now that certainty was rotting inside her. Morgan said nothing when he served supper that night. He never did. But Keiko watched his eyes. She thought she saw something different there. Not anger, but knowing. A quiet recognition, as if he too had seen the picture in the newspaper, as if he knew that she had seen it. She took her tray and bowed lower than usual. He gave no response. He only moved on to the next. The stew tasted the same, but she couldn't finish it. In the tent, another woman finally said it. Just once, barely audible. What if we were the monsters? No one answered, because how could they? Keiko lay in her bedroll that night, staring at the knot in the wooden beam above her. She remembered her instructors back in Japan, the discipline drills, the lectures on loyalty, the screaming man with a riding crop who told them that Westerners were animals, that they would destroy everything sacred, that to surrender was worse than death. But here, the men who cooked their food did not scream. They did not beat. They did not humiliate. They gave blankets. They gave ink. They gave shepherd's pie. And suddenly the idea of justice no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a question that no one wanted to answer. Because if the world had flipped upside down, if kindness lived behind barbed wire and cruelty wore her flag, then what did that make her? What did that make them all? It was 2 days after the newspaper clipping when Morgan placed the book on the serving table. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, the kind of act that carried meaning only if you chose to see it. Keiko noticed it at once. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't offered openly either. The cover was worn to the color of dry leaves, the edges soft from years of hands turning its pages. When she approached to collect her tray, he merely gestured toward it, a small tilt of his head. Then he looked away. Keiko hesitated, glancing between the book and the man. The queue behind her shifted impatiently, boots scraping the ground. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. She opened the front cover, and there, written in small, uneven handwriting, was a single line. "You have time now." The title read, "David Copperfield." She didn't understand the words, but the handwriting, that brief, fragile note, rooted her in place. That night, under the dim flicker of the oil lamp, she traced her fingers over the letters again and again. The book smelled faintly of flour and smoke, like the camp kitchen. She couldn't read more than a handful of English words, but the pages fascinated her. The shape of the language, the rhythm of the letters, the neat rows of meaning locked away behind her ignorance. She turned each page slowly, as though handling a sacred object. The next day she gathered the courage to approach Morgan. It was after supper, when most had gone back to their tents, and the sky was fading from violet to black. He was scrubbing pots outside the kitchen shed. She stood a few paces away, the book clutched to her chest. "Name?" she asked quietly, pointing to the cover. "This name?" Morgan looked up, puzzled at first. Then he smiled faintly. "Copperfield," he said, pronouncing it slowly, touching his chest for David, and then gesturing outward. "Book. Book," she repeated, her accent hard against the English syllables. He nodded. For a moment they just stood there, the silence not heavy, but uncertain. Then Keiko bowed awkwardly. "Thank you," she said, her tongue clumsy over the unfamiliar words. Morgan blinked. Then, with a faint nod, he replied, "You're welcome." It was the first English phrase she had spoken aloud, and the first time anyone had answered her like she was a person. In the days that followed, she began to read more. Not the meaning, not yet, but the rhythm. She memorized shapes of words, how they curled and collided, how they seemed to march across the page with quiet purpose. Occasionally, she would approach Morgan with a question, holding the book open, pointing to a line. He would glance down, murmur the word, and she would repeat it back. "Home," he said once. "Home?" she echoed. He looked at her then, and something flickered in his eyes, something like sorrow. For Keiko, those small lessons became a secret ritual. She wasn't just learning a language, she was learning a way of being that didn't depend on orders, ranks, or flags. Each word she understood chipped away at the barrier between them, between captor and captive, between the lies she'd been taught and the truths she was discovering on her own. Sometimes she caught Morgan watching her read, his face unreadable, the firelight glinting against his spectacles. Other times he'd leave scraps of paper tucked inside the pages, a list of simple words with rough translations scribbled in pencil. Sun, bread, forgive, forgive. That word lingered. She turned it over in her mind like a coin she wasn't sure how to spend. Could she forgive him? There was nothing to forgive. Could she forgive her country, her leaders, herself? At night she whispered the new words softly into the dark, tasting them like medicine, unsure if they healed or hurt. Morgan never asked what she thought of the book, but she could feel his quiet hope in the way he slid her tray across the table each day, in the way he nodded when she said, "Thank you," a little more clearly. He had given her food for the body once. Now he was giving her food for the soul. And for the first time since the war began, Keiko realized that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about learning how to live again, even behind barbed wire. The announcement came on a morning that smelled of rain. A guard entered their tent holding a clipboard, his voice low but certain. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Keiko sat still, the words washing over her like fog rolling through a valley. Around her, the others looked at each other in silence. No cheers, no cries, only a stunned, quiet reckoning. The empire they had sworn to die for had fallen. Within days, preparations began. The repatriation process moved like everything else in the camp, efficiently, without ceremony. Names were called, papers signed, uniforms returned. A list was posted by the gate, rows of characters that meant, "You are going home." But what did home even mean now? For Keiko, the realization came slowly, like a bruise forming beneath the skin. She had feared captivity. Now she feared release. The thought of stepping back into a country that had taught her to hate, that had told her to starve with pride rather than live with shame, it terrified her. The morning of her departure, the sky was heavy with clouds. The women gathered by the trucks, bundles clutched in their arms. Some wept quietly, others stared straight ahead. Keiko held only a small satchel of belongings, a thin blanket, her worn copy of David Copperfield, and a folded note she had written to herself and never sent. She wasn't looking for Morgan. She didn't expect him. But as she climbed onto the bed of the truck, she turned. And there he was, standing just behind the mess tent, apron folded over his arm, boots caked with kitchen ash. In his hand, wrapped in cloth and bound with twine, was a small, round tin. He stepped forward without a word. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he extended the tin. She took it. The cloth was soft, clean, recently washed. The tin was sealed tight, its surface warm. She didn't have to ask what was inside. Shepherd's pie. Her fingers closed around it like it was made of gold. Morgan looked at her, not like a prisoner, not like a stranger, but as something far more fragile and more difficult to name. A survivor, a student, a person. Keiko bowed, deeply. He nodded once. That was all, and somehow it was enough. The truck engine growled to life, and as it pulled away, Keiko didn't look back. She stared down at the tin in her lap, tears threatening but refusing to fall. It was absurd, this meal, this simple dish, and yet it felt heavier than any medal, more sacred than any flag. What did it mean to carry food home from the enemy? To bring back not just nourishment, but evidence that someone on the other side had looked at her and decided she was worth feeding, not interrogating, not punishing. Feeding. The tin became more than a gift. It was a message, a riddle, a contradiction wrapped in warmth and sealed with memory. And it wasn't just for her. It was for the family she might never see again. For the country that would never believe what she'd lived. For the future she hadn't dared imagine until someone, a cook with burn-scarred hands, taught her how to say, "Thank you," without words. Morgan had never called her by name. He had never asked hers either. But every Thursday, he had answered the question that none of her commanders ever had. Are we still human, even when we lose? And his answer had been quiet, heavy, and served in a steaming tray. The ship that carried Keiko home was nothing like the one that had brought her across the ocean. There were no songs, no speeches, no banners, just silence, thick and endless, broken only by the groaning of metal and the churn of waves. The women huddled on deck, eyes fixed on the horizon, each lost in her own thoughts. Some wept openly. Others stared into the sea, their faces unreadable. Keiko held her satchel close to her chest, one hand resting protectively on the tin inside. Japan appeared out of the mist like a memory half forgotten. The coastline looked smaller than she remembered. The mountains that had once seemed proud now felt like bones jutting from the earth. When the ship docked, the air carried the scent of ash and decay. Her country was unrecognizable. Cities had been flattened, villages abandoned. The train stations filled with ghosts, people with hollow eyes, wrapped in rags, clutching what little they had left. Keiko stepped off the ship and found herself walking through a graveyard disguised as a homeland. She made her way to Kumamoto, the town where she had been born. Or what was left of it. The streets she once knew were gone. Her family home, a small wooden house near the river, was nothing but blackened beams. She found the foundation stones still warm under the afternoon sun and sat down among them. There was no one waiting. The neighbors who passed offered pitying glances but no words. She learned the truth from a letter passed quietly from one woman to another. Her mother had died during an air raid the previous spring. Her younger brother had been drafted and never returned. There was no grave, no ceremony. Just a line in a government record somewhere, another name swallowed by the war. That night, Keiko sat alone by what had once been her doorstep. She unwrapped the cloth from around the tin. The twine fell away softly, like a thread pulled from a dream. The tin was dented now from travel, but still sealed. She opened it with trembling hands. The scent that escaped was faint but unmistakable. Onions, meat, and potato. Shepherd's pie. For a long time, she just stared at it. Then she ate, slowly, carefully, reverently. Each bite was memory. The camp, the kitchen, the smoke from the fire, the clatter of tin trays, Morgan's quiet nod, the women's laughter echoing in disbelief. Every taste brought it all back, not the horror of war, but the strange, unbearable kindness that had existed inside it. When the last bite was gone, she folded the empty cloth and pressed it to her lips. It was all she had left that still felt real. In the weeks that followed, she tried to rebuild what little could be rebuilt. She worked in a factory that paid in rice. She slept in a barrack with other widows and orphans. Sometimes she taught the younger girls simple English words, the ones Morgan had taught her. Home, bread, forgive. They repeated them like prayers. But each evening, when she walked home, the scent of cooking, even the faintest trace of potato or onion, would stop her in her tracks. It was never quite the same. Too sharp, too thin, too different. And yet it brought tears every time. People around her learned not to ask why. Keiko never saw Morgan again. She never expected to. But she carried him with her, in the way she shared her food, in the way she refused to let bitterness take root. Sometimes she would see British newspapers at the port, and she'd wonder if he still stood in that same kitchen, ladling stew for others who could not thank him. Years later, when her hair had turned silver, she would tell her granddaughter, "Kindness is heavier than hate. It never leaves you." And when she cooked, she always began with potatoes and onions. Not because they tasted good, but because they reminded her that dignity could survive even when everything else did not. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you on your commute? At home? Somewhere across the world? If you want more stories like this one, tap the like button, hit subscribe just below the video, and click the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. It's your support that helps us keep bringing forgotten histories like Keiko's to light.